Group 1. The player. Especially early on, the game is difficult in myriad ways, specific to player agency, to instill in you the proper fear and caution, and by proxy tension, of surviving and operating in this wasteland away from your safe home in the vault. Through this, you can determine that the developers understand to great lengths the various and exceeding difficulties of living in the wasteland, especially with other people. As such, it is this understanding of these various and that become the scope of the player agency. Yet these limitations are fitting for the setting, and the developers explore concepts with them to effective results. They aren't joking around with the lethality of living out here. Dehydration, radiation, random encounters with vicious enemies. That's not accounting for the player limitations we'll get into. I mean, the entire reason for starting your endeavor is because your vault has a very limited supply of water, and now it can't produce anymore. Unfortunately, in Fallout's case, the devs were still working out how to execute some of the mechanical limitations of the player in a way that is narratively apt and feels good. Instead, until the player reaches above 70% in a combat skill, it'll be at least some of the time. While this could be seen as a highly committed mechanic to the themes of the narrative, and to some extent I do see it that way, that being poor skill makes for poor results. This system by itself is already really awesome at achieving what it's trying to get at. The only issue is it doesn't operate by itself. It still tangibly hurts iteration time in a way that feels unfair, even for the setting. Again, even if this was intentionally unfair, until you dump enough points into a particular weapon skill, it creates an unnecessary obstacle for progression through eating up the player's limited playtime. I won't say wasting the player's time, because in a setting like this, death can have an ideal conditioning effect on the player if done correctly. Honestly, I'm on the fence on whether or not this was implemented well enough here to get away with it. It will still hurt iteration time, but sacrificing it for something of value and only sparingly will always be worth the conditioning. The way it is implemented, it still does the conditioning, yet it does this at the expense of the player through the tangibly impractical loss of their time, rather than sacrificing something mechanically or narratively in-game. Even within the context of just Fallout's combat, this mechanic's implementation just doesn't feel as deliberate or precise as similar limitations like those found in the ability point system, movement, health, and armor or firearm systems. You can only ever have like 12 ability points to use in action without drugs in combat, and that's if you really know what you're doing and spec your character accordingly. Most people won't, because the game doesn't tell you a lot about how the world works from the character create screen. The developers even design around this, making sure that there's only one, maybe two weapons you'll ever find in this game that have a low enough AP cost to where you can use them more than once in a turn. Even more bonus points when you find out that one of these weapons has a globally limited supply of ammunition that cannot be replenished. This is great for giving the player the sense of uncovering a whole world of people and interest groups outside of your vault, just as well as finding how much influence you have where you probably thought it would be certain death. But this sucks when you're given a stat like ability points in the character create screen with no context as to how it's used. One could surmise that there's a grid system and 1 point equals 1 step, but what about combat? Without knowing what weapons are available and their associated AP costs ahead of time, there's no way to truly optimize your character for a certain weapon or type of weapon, even though that's implied with the tag skill mechanic and the myriad specific weapon skills right next to all the other specific. This, in my first few times around, contributed to the feeling of my character being an outsider meant for a different kind of place. And now I needed to compensate for it in order to make progress in this kind of place with these kinds of peoples.
Don't feel bad. Ain't the worst story I've been told.
It's definitely not perfect, but at least this time it's sacrificing player expectations and mechanics for potential conditioning aligned with the narrative, instead of sacrificing a real-world resource like time. In practice, you get one shot of your weapon and a few steps to take, or you can use some items. Then, you are beholden to the mercy of however many enemies that get a good enough angle on you. This is a massive limitation of player agency, in particular when compared to instant pauses for instant heals and individual player skill determining the outcomes in firefights for the 3D games. Aside from 4. I mentioned Joseph Anderson in the intro, so I've linked his video on 4 in particular if you want to know how I feel about it, at least in the broad sense. Back to the limitations, aside from the fundamental differences between turn-based and real-time combat, Movement takes up AP, and they even give you access to perks tied to this mechanic if you find you need it or prefer it. I don't exactly understand how the armor system works,
But I do know that metal armor sucks.
I mean, look
Welded
at it.
together by someone on the same wavelength as this genius here.
I was shocked to see that a well-made looking set of leather armor had a better armor class. This peaks with the power armor. Getting this is hard fought, and usually after the first half of the game. The game manifests this build-up both mechanically and narratively. It feels like a genuine reward when you stumble across a pack of raiders in it, or when it saves you from getting blasted into the wall. Bonus points because the devs take the time to explore this. It also ends up recontextualizing the characterization for both the factions and the individuals who utilize the armor, and those who have encountered it and lived to tell the tale. Since it comes so late, you're more likely to get that initial context before you get the armor yourself. Even the little stuff feels really thought out, like the bigger creatures getting to move multiple tiles in one step. A single step taking 5 AP if one of your legs has been blown off. Leftover AP going to your AC at the end of a turn. Hilariously, weapon malfunctions and
Fucking oops, I guess.
line of sight.
Thanks, Ian.
And the AP cost of opening your inventory or reloading all cement the deliberateness of the limitations of the reality you play in. However, missing a point-blank shot because you can never get better than 1 in 20 odds feels like garbage, whether it's at the beginning of the game with low skill points or late game maxed out. The limitations found within the combat system, and specifically the AP system, serve to condition the player to truly reckon with how little they can accomplish within a single turn. This doesn't sound like much, but for reasons we'll get into later, and because of the almost magical interaction between the groups of mechanics I mentioned earlier, they and the rest of the player mechanics form the cornerstones of the narrative experience through how the player is presented to and interacts with these mechanics. Getting swarmed by enemies is easy, and carving a way out with your body and your party intact is no small feat, both because of what you're fighting, but also because you can only do so much before your turn ends. This combat system is a blanket background of tension, punctuated by little leeways or indulgences you take, snapping back into place, scooping out large chunks of health when you fuck up or don't account for something in a fight, while encounters drain ammunition and healing supplies throughout your endeavor. This level of limitation, its deliberateness, is the friction against which the player will need to persevere throughout their entire story. I think that's pretty fitting for the setting, and especially for the story the developers wanted to tell. This goes in direct opposition to the classes design that Tim Kaine mentions in his retrospective. A large design element was implemented in contrast to the stereotypes people were usually given. Kaine wanted unique combinations of playstyles and personalities through the special stat and skill point system. Any kind of person could make these decisions, so the freedom of variety is attempted through the different solutions that are presented to or found by the player as well as their skills and stats. From our perspective here, the player character's main form of interacting with the world outside combat is through these skills directly related to the task at hand. The game commits to this deliberateness through various pressures and follows through with mechanical consequences for the player. If you don't have enough strength to lift a weapon, it becomes practically useless without dumping an entire level worth of skill points per level of strength into the specific weapon skill that corresponds with the weapon you want to use. This forces you to compromise on other skills and hyper-specialize in a certain weapon category, possibly even pulling from other non-combat related skills. Or in canon, your character needs to learn how to overcome their physical shortcomings before you, the player, can overcome a mechanical limitation. A 100% in a weapon skill only means as much as the weapon you can and are holding and have ammunition for. You can only ever unlock double the on-paper full damage at 100% skill. Range, accuracy, and damage of a weapon cannot be improved beyond a certain point. Compared to a lower skill, going over 100% doesn't net you any more damage, only improving the chance of landing a hit through minimizing failures or malfunctions. Even where the game gives you a gun and technically says yes, you can shoot anyone or anything that you would like. It has already disincentivized any unnecessary combat through all the narratively cohesive limitations placed upon the player just in the combat, let alone through other limitations. If you do not know how things are valued in the wastes through your skills and bartering, you will get taken advantage of when trading goods. If you don't know how computers work, you won't be able to fix one having issues. Alternatively, to the game's favor, because this game was developed by geniuses, skills can be enhanced. You don't have the skill to pick a lock, certain equipment can push you over the threshold. Same with repairing broken objects or machinery. There are books on various topics related to your skills that raise their percentages up to 100%. An absolute godsend for anyone attempting a low intelligence run or spec their character in a way that precludes certain skills. The game also takes the time to craft mandatory and extra events and puzzles for the player that engage both mechanically on these levels as well as thematically on the levels of the rest of the narrative encounters. Having tangible mechanical limitations and narrative or mechanical rewards when the players invest in a certain skill and consequences for the player when they don't makes choosing which ones to specialize in nail-biting, a genuine compromise, and in practice, a search for an alternative solution outside your skill set. These few examples of committing to the player limitations contribute massively to the friction between what the player wants to achieve and the environment in which they must contend to achieve it. This is absolutely fitting for the setting and goes as far as representing the core narrative through the limitations. Totally committing to this kind of design while interweaving the rest of the game's mechanics turns out to be a trouble spot, but we'll come back to this. Group 2. The environment.